So now let's start talking about demand. Remember, demand is the buy side of the market. In a market, the people demanding are the buyers. And so the information we get here is essentially going to be characterized in what we call a demand function. A demand function here is just a relationship between the price of the good and the amount the buyer wants to purchase. So for instance, it would say, hey, apples are $1.99 a pound. How many pounds of apples do you want to buy? Or another way you can pose this question is, hey, what would the price need to be for you to buy 10 pounds of apples? And so this demand function is just this sort of giving us this nice relationship between price and the amount the buyer wants to purchase. It won't be necessarily the amount the buyer purchases at a price. That has to be given by equilibrium, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And so, okay, demand functions are given to us in sort of two ways. One is the demand schedule. All it is a table of prices and quantities. So here in the schedule, how we look at it, in our left-hand column here, we have a price of ice cream cone ranging from $0 to $3. And then we have the quantity that the buyer would like to purchase in cones, from which, if the price of an ice cream cone was $0, it was free, the buyer would want 12 of them. If the price of an ice cream cone was $2, the buyer would want 4 of them. And then obviously if the price of the ice cream cone went up to $3, the buyer just doesn't want to buy anymore. And so this schedule is just sort of one way. And we can ask the same question. For instance, if the price of the ice cream cone was $2, how many would you want? Oh, I'd want 4 ice cream cones. We could also ask, what would the price need to be for you to want to buy 8 ice cream cones? Well, we look at the table, we find in the quantity column 8, and we find the associated price of $1. So yeah, demand schedules. It's just the basic table of demand. The other way we really see this is in a curve, demand curve. And so here in economics, what we do is we plot price here on the y-axis, that's the price of an ice cream cone, and then the quantity demanded on the x-axis, so that's the quantity of ice cream cones that the buyer wants to buy. And the line here, this blue line, is the demand curve. Any point on that just sort of gives us the demand function. And so we can sort of look here, for instance, we have, a decrease in price. Let's say price went down from $2 to $1.50. Well, we can go over to the curve and learn what happens to demand. So if the price was $2, the quantity demanded is 4 ice cream cones, excuse me. But when the price shifts down to $1.50, we see, going back to the curve, $1.50, we go over, oh, well, that means that the quantity demanded is 6 ice cream cones. And so one thing to sort of notice between the schedule and the curve is that there's sort of this, what we call an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. In other words, if a good gets more expensive, you're going to want to demand less of it. And if a good gets less expensive, you're going to want to demand more of it. So if we just go back and look at the curve for a second, what we see this means is that the curve is sloping downwards. Or in other words, in economics, we always talk about we have downward sloping demand. And so in general, there's just this inverse relationship between price and quantity. So if you're plotting your demand curve on your graph, always make sure that it's sloping downwards. If you have your demand curve sloping upwards, you're getting it most likely confused with supply. Another really sort of important thing here is to think about the differences in sort of levels of demand. And by levels, I mean sort of here we can think about like my demand for apples, which would be I have a certain price for each price. I'm going to demand a certain amount of apples, or in our previous example, ice cream cones. But the market overall is going to react differently because we're all going to all the buyers are going to come together and we're going to sort of sum our demands. And that's going to be our market demand. It's going to be the sum. So I think it's going to be easier to see this from the table. So here we have a sort of a table, and let's just say this market is just made up of Catherine and Nicholas. So for Catherine and Nicholas, we each have their demand schedules. So we sort of see, oh, well, at $0, Catherine wants to buy 12 cones, and at $3, Catherine doesn't want to buy a cone. And then the same thing for Nicholas. At $0, Nicholas wants to buy 7 cones, and at $3, Nicholas wants to buy 1 cone. Well, we can think about let's just think about them as the market. They're the only 2 buyers. Well, all we have to do to figure out market demand, that is the demand for ice cream cones in the entire market, is just sum up their individual quantities. So at $0, Catherine wanted 12 and Nicholas wanted 7, so the market demand will just be 19. And then back down at $3, Catherine didn't want any and Nicholas wanted 1, so 0 plus 1 is just 1, and the market demand is 1. And so when we think about demand, we usually are focused on market demand, because market demand is going to be what's going to be important to pin down prices. Another way we could have figured out this demand, market demand from individuals' demands, is to do it with the curves. So here we have Catherine's demand curve and Nicholas's demand curve. Remember, they're the only 2 participants in this market, and all we have to do is sort of add these curves together. And so what you see here is there's this point highlighted at $2, where Catherine is demanding 4 ice cream cones and Nicholas is demanding 3 ice cream cones, and together the market demand there is 7. So all you have to do is just sum these curves together, and that gives you market demand. And like I said, market demand is the thing. Like, individuals' demands are important, but right now we're going to almost focus entirely on market demand. So now we know how to define demand for a good. But it's kind of important to note this is just demand for an instance in time. Things like income can change. An income can change a consumer's demand. Or the price of a related good changes, and that can also change a consumer's demand. So what we also have to think about is how demand shifts. And so basically, we can either think about demand increasing or decreasing. And sort of a related way of thinking about this is, a lot of times you'll hear an increase in demand we're calling it the demand curve shifts to the right. And a decrease in demand is the demand curve shifts to the left. And so it's important to know both of these terms or both ways of saying increase and decrease, because they both get used interchangeably. So let's look here. This is an example of the demand curve shifting. So let's say we're back in our ice cream cones market. Let's say our demand is given by D1, and all of a sudden income increases. People have more money to spend on ice cream cones. Well, all of a sudden that demand curve might shift to D2. So our original demand curve was D1, the new demand curve is D2, and you can sort of see it's just a shift to the right. In a similar way, let's say income decreased instead. Well, maybe our old demand curve was D1, maybe our new demand curve is D3. And well, if you have less income, you're going to have a decrease in demand for ice cream cones. You just have less money to spend on ice cream cones. And so our demand curve shifts from D1 to D3, or shifts to the left. So the interesting things are what causes these shifts. Well, there's a whole lot of them. We're going to sort of talk about these 5 because these 5 are the major causes. I'm going to focus on 1 and 2 today, and then briefly describe the next 3 in a minute. So the big one, and economists think about this a lot, and we spend a lot of time trying to understand the income effect. It talks about how income effect is really talking about how a change in your income will cause a change in your demand. So we sort of have 2 types of goods we can think about here: a normal good and an inferior good. And so a normal good, I always think about steak when I think about a normal good. It causes, if all of a sudden I had an increase in income, I really like steak, so I'd have to have an increase in demand. And so normal goods really here are just increase in income causes increase in demand. Inferior goods, what I think about is being back in college or undergrad and eating ramen noodles way too much. Well, all of a sudden I worked for a couple of years and ramen noodles were just not appealing anymore to me. I know some people will disagree with me, some people really love ramen, but I find ramen as an inferior good. As my income increased, I just didn't want to eat ramen anymore. And so that's it. It's just an inferior good is one where your income increases you have a decrease in demand for that good. The other big one we care about a lot is sort of the price of related goods. So, related goods. I probably drink too much soda that's good for me, but I like soda. And so for me, a related good is Coke and Pepsi. They both sort of fulfill my need for soda in different ways, though. And so let's think about this. Imagine all of a sudden Coke went up $2 a bottle. I'd probably consume less Coke and consume more Pepsi. This is because for me, Coke and Pepsi are substitutes. An increase in the price of Coke caused me an increase in my demand for Pepsi. And so another thing we can think about when we think about price of related goods is what we call complements. So a good example of a complement for me would probably be steak and wine, though that's probably not the best example of a complement, but let's just go with it. So I like having wine with my steak. If all of a sudden the price of steak decreased, I'd probably buy a bottle of wine to go with my steak. Or if the price of steak increased, I'm probably just not going to consume as much wine because maybe I only like consuming it with steak. And so here we would consider steak and wine complements. An increase in the price of steak causes a decrease in the demand for wine. And so it's just good to think for a minute about what would be sort of substitutes and complements in your own life. I have my own examples of Coke and Pepsi and wine and steak, but really try to connect this into things and do the same with inferior and normal goods. Think about what in your life you're buying right now is a normal good and what is an inferior good. And just try to find examples. Okay, so the three other big shifters that I'm just going to briefly mention. So tastes. Tastes are sort of like your preference for things. So like maybe when things like your taste change, maybe, for example, you used to like Apple phones, but now you don't like them so much and you want to move to Android. And your taste shifted to Android phones. Another thing is expectations. So we saw during COVID-19 that the expectation was that people were just not going to be able to find stuff, namely toilet paper, right? Everyone saw articles about how toilet paper was being bought out. And so the expectation is, in the future, I'm not going to be able to find toilet paper. So today I want to buy more for the store for later. And then the final big shifter here is the number of buyers who enter the market. And that would be, if all of a sudden there's more people demanding the good, there's obviously going to be an increase in demand. Okay. So that about covers the sort of qualitative overview of demand. Just remember, I think the key points here to remember is one, demand can be given by both a schedule or a curve. That usually demand is downward sloped, or there's an inverse relationship between price and demand. And that demand shifts for a variety of reasons. And just remember the idea of normal goods, inferior goods, complements, substitutes, and just sort of remember the big five shifters that we talked about. And that will basically cover it for demand for today. So now we're going to actually end up moving over to the other side of the market. Demand was the buy side of the market. Now we need to talk about the sell side of the market in supply.